So good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. So I'm going to talk about restoring New Mexico's forests after high severity wildfire. But first, I'm going to run through a bit of background about why and how those large catastrophic fires happen, as it directly relates to the problems that we face when we're trying to restore post-wildfire areas. So historically, the forests of New Mexico had low stand densities with a few large trees dominating the landscape. Small, frequent fires spread across the undergrowth, burning small trees and shrubs, but left large trees unharmed. These low severity, frequent fires reinforce the forest structures that we see today in places like the Gila National Forest, with open forests with street stands separated by grassland. But around the 1900s, the Forest Service started putting out all forest fires to safeguard potential timber supplies, substantially reducing the amount of fire on the landscape. This resulted in dense forests with many small trees and shrubs. With more fuel on the landscape, when fires are lit, they burn hotter and longer and spread further. And the mature trees, which would have previously survived in historically sparse forests 100 years ago, also go up in flames. This leaves large areas of previously forested land without any live trees, resulting in large open areas without forest cover, like we see in New Mexico and the Jemez Mountains after the Los Conchas fire. Also, ongoing climate change has made these high severity fires more likely, with less rain and rising temperatures across the Southwest, make now abundant potential fuels in forests drier and more likely to burn. For high severity burn areas to naturally regenerate after wildfire, seeds need to disperse from surviving mature forests and successfully establish in hot, dry areas without the shade of other trees to shield them from high temperatures, and not that many seeds survive to grow into trees. We can accelerate forest restoration by planting tree seedlings, but without the shade provided by other trees, the survival of even planted seedlings in high severity fire footprints is low, averaging just 25% across multiple sites in Arizona and New Mexico. And that's down to the particularly harsh climate conditions in the footprint of high severity wildfires. This is a thermal image of part of the Los Conchas burn area that I took a couple of weeks ago. And you can see there that there's substantial areas which reach 44 degrees centigrade or 111 degrees Fahrenheit. In one of our surveys, Forest Service planted seedlings in this area had a survival rate of just 13% after 3 years. Given that tree seedlings have a narrower climatic niche than adult individuals of the same species, these high temperatures can limit establishment even in areas that have previously supported adult trees. And given when we look at temperature in the micro scale, temperatures are even more extreme. So here's a recent thermal image taken from a drone flight in the Ute Park fire footprint that I took last Thursday, which was a scorcher. And this is a top-down view taken from about 60 meters above the ground. The maximum temperature that you can see there is 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and the minimum is 90. So when we're planting tree seedlings in high severity fire footprints, given the lack of shade and the impacts of climate change, we're asking a lot of them to survive in these harsh thermal environments. So to tackle this problem, the Earth Systems Ecology Lab at UNM has been working pretty intensively in the Los Conchas fire footprint in the Jemez Mountains since 2017. We've planted and measured the survival and growth of over 2,000 tree seedlings, collected climate data in hundreds of different locations, and mapped the area in high detail with drones. By continuously monitoring our planted seedlings and the different conditions in different parts of the landscape, we've gained a deep understanding of what governs planted seedling survival. So from here, I'm going to present 3 of these experiments, each of which is aiming to gain insights into the reforestation issue in the Southwest and what we can do to increase seedling survival and growth and restore the forests that we've lost to wildfire. So in this first experiment, we set out to map the thermal environment that seedlings experience when they're planted in high severity burn patches, and to identify areas that offer refuge from the prevailing harsh climate condition in those areas. This is a view of the Lost Conscious fire just after it happened in 2011, with large areas of 100% tree mortality. It's within that area that we put 40 I buttons, which are small microclimate data loggers, which record temperature and humidity. And we place those in the same position that seedlings would be planted at, just off the ground, across an elevation gradient. So those I buttons record both temperature and humidity, and that allows us to calculate vapor pressure deficit, which is the difference between the amount of moisture in the air and how much moisture the air can hold when it's saturated. And VPD has been shown to be particularly important for plants, as it signals how much moisture a plant needs to draw from its roots if it's not available in the air. Our microclimate data loggers showed that temperatures regularly reached above 60 degrees centigrade or 100 degrees Fahrenheit at the ground level during the summer months. And relative humidity is really low at the same time, meaning vapor pressure deficit is high and seedlings are relying on precipitation during long, hot summers to survive. But knowing this alone doesn't allow us to map these thermal environments or explore where we might find climatic refugia. For that, we need drones like this one, which we can fly over our plots and capture those environments in 3 dimensions in great detail. Like in this 3D model, where we take lots of 2-dimensional photographs and stitch them together using a process called structure from motion photogrammetry, which creates a 3D model, which we can then model incoming solar radiation and where water might flow upon that landscape, and really dig down by combining those microclimate data loggers with this 3D imagery. Sorry. Oh, right, here we go. So this is, each of these images shows modeled incoming solar radiation as measured by kilowatts per meter squared. And now with this spatial component, tying incoming solar radiation to our temperature and humidity recordings from our data loggers, we can predict our microclimate sensor readings as a product of incoming solar radiation and other weather effects like rain, wind, cloud cover across months of time, instead of just snapshots that we get from thermal imagery. So using a machine learning model, we can predict those measurements with an accuracy of about 83%. Across different models for different temperatures, we have temperature at the cross, min, max, and mean temperature across those different months, relative humidity, and VPD. And you can see there on the right-hand side of each of those graphs, the relative influence of each of those different variable types. And whilst it might look like potential incoming solar radiation plays a small part, that's the spatial component, which shows us where those temperatures are distributed. Now, using those models, we can then extrapolate those out to maps. Here we can see with our modeled microclimate temperatures of that same plot that shrubs play a big part in buffering against solar radiation, creating areas which are much cooler and wetter than the surrounding landscape. Now that's apparent even in cooler months, like here in October. We have those modeled values on the left, a histogram of those values with the mean shown by that red dashed line and the difference from the mean shown on the right-hand side. And you can see how shrubs are the big component in reducing those temperatures from in the open to under shrubs. And that's even more pronounced in the hottest month, June, where maximum temperatures can change by 13 degrees Celsius or 55 degrees Fahrenheit in just a few meters if they're within the shade of a shrub. And those shrubs also increase relative humidity and decrease VPD, making even the hottest months survivable for seedlings if they're planted underneath or beside shrubs. And if we zoom in a bit on our models and highlight where vegetation is, we can see this splash effect of shrubs, mediating the temperatures to the east and west of them as the sun rises and then sets repeatedly over the course of a month, making these ideal places to plant tree seedlings, especially in low elevation, high severity burn patches where near surface temperatures are high. And we see the same effect in natural settings where seedlings do well if they're within close proximity to shrubs like this gamble oak here. So our conclusions from our first study were existing vegetation in post-fire landscapes can buffer solar radiation, decreasing temperatures and increasing moisture availability. That means that planting crews could be trained to target those locations near shrubs to plant seedlings, as this buffers them against those highest temperatures during the summer months. But it also left us asking, what if those shrubs act as competition for planted seedlings? And what else can we do at the planting stage to increase planted seedling survival? So to answer this question, we then planted 1,000 tree seedlings from 3 different species, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and white pine, under shrubs or in the open, and with or without biochar as a soil amendment, and then monitored their growth and survival every 6 months for 2.5 years. Biochar, by the way, as I'm sure you know, is organic matter which is burnt in a low oxygen environment, which results in a fine charcoal substance which is really porous, and it traps nutrients and water, and has been shown to increase crop yields and plant growth in some agricultural species. So we planted our seedlings as shown in these diagrams, where they're close enough together that the overarching climate that they're experiencing was the same. But they're planted in clumps, so each species was represented in each treatment type. So either planted in the open, under a shrub, and with or without biochar. After 2.5 years, seedlings planted underneath shrubs had a 46% increase in survival, and the biochar increased survival by 11% across all species of those that survived. You can see there that the white pine and the Douglas fir all died out in the open. Also, ponderosa pine seedlings had a fairly dramatic increase in height growth if they were planted underneath shrubs, you can see there on the left, probably due to the water availability that was there underneath shrubs, and the solar radiation buffering mean they had to stretch a bit further to get the light. But as that competition element that we set out to discover, traditionally foresters view shrubs in fire footprints as competitors for scarce resources to planted seedlings. But we found only a slight decrease in seedling growth underneath shrubs when they're compared to the size of the shrubs that they were under, and shown in CHM there, which is the canopy height model, the amount of shrub above a seedling, and also the distance to the shrub edge. So 0 distance being right on the edge, and a large distance being in the middle. So we saw a slight decrease there, but given the big boost in seedling survival of seedlings planted underneath shrubs, planting underneath shrubs had overall big benefits. So results show that planting underneath shrubs increased survival by 46% after 3 years, with only small decreases in seedling diameter growth. And biochar had a positive effect on seedling survival, probably due to its ability to retain moisture and nutrients during drought conditions, although it didn't increase seedling growth. Excuse me. So for our final study that I'm going to present today, we combined our previous findings in our largest scale experiment to date, in which we combined microclimate data loggers, planted seedling survival, and remotely sensed topographic data to see what governs planted seedling survival over whole landscapes. Using our microclimate data loggers and by monitoring seedling survival with 700 planted seedlings of 4 different species over 3 years, we used a piecewise exponential model that rates the effect of each variable on the survival of planted seedlings. I'm not sure if you can see there, but we have a lot of climate type variables, such as summer mean daily VPD, summer temperature, and the amount of precipitation in spring, for example. But those factors didn't have as big an impact as topographical variables like slope and heat load index, which had the biggest influence. This is because those variables govern how both solar radiation and precipitation are distributed across a landscape in consistent, predictable ways across multiple years. Whilst we can't predict how much rain is going to fall on a post-wildfire landscape in the future, using topographical indices, we can predict where that rain will flow and which areas will be the wettest, and which slopes receive the most sunlight and which will be the hottest, and also where those dips and valleys are, which might protect our planted seedlings from high winds. Topographical indices govern how microclimates are formed and are good predictors of seedling survival. And given that, by using just these topographical indices as inputs in machine learning-based models for ponderosa pine seedling survival, we've mapped the probability of those seedling survival across the lost conscious fire footprint, which you can see there on the left, with the black areas being unsuitable for planted seedlings and those white areas being ideal places. On the right, you can see how each of those topographical variables we used affects the probability of seedling survival. I'm just going to try and do a laser pointer here. So across our x-axis, we see heat load index higher being hotter, and our mean model value, that's the probability of planted seedling survival. So lower degrees of heat load index increase seedling survival, and the opposite is true also for topographical wetness index, where wetter is better, and our seedlings prefer environments which that's where water will flow. So with this machine learning model, we're able to project seedling survival probability across large landscapes using digital elevation models. In New Mexico, we're lucky enough to have 1 meter available DEMs, which is the same resolution that this model is created at. And those models predict correctly seedling survival with a 63% accuracy. And due to the universality of those variables, which are just derived from those DEMs, we can project these models across multiple landscapes. So the results of this study show that topical indices influence seedling survival in predictable ways. And that allows us to extrapolate those findings to wider landscapes, mapping the probability of seedling survival. So far, we produced those models for the whole of the Lost Conscious Fire area, a section of the Lunar Fire by Chagron, the Ute Park Fire near Cimarron, and the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon Fire here in New Mexico, which was requested by the Forest Service to inform some of their planting regimes. This machine learning approach has a lot of benefits, mainly because we can incorporate lots of data. We have the ability to incorporate seedling survival data from anywhere in the Southwest, and any additional data would help improve our models. We can also incorporate numerous other data types to identify what variables influence tree seedling survival and growth, from the conditions that the seedlings are exposed to in transit, to seed source location, to planting method. We can include a host of data into machine learning models to improve predictions, both in terms of landscape position where seedlings are planted and the methods we use to produce the seedlings. From seed to outplanting, all of those data can be incorporated into various different models, as long as we have that post-planting monitoring to see the effects of those different methods down the line. And these types of data can be iteratively incorporated into models to consistently improve our predictions of seedling survival and growth through time. We can combine seed source selection, nursery practices that increase seedlings resistance to drought, best outplanting practices, and targeted planting in areas which promote seedling survival, and combine all of these data into the models which identify which methods are most effective. With improved models, there comes a lot of benefits. Cost-effective use of reforestation resources, sure, because why plant in areas which have very low seedling survival probability, but also we can plant forests that have baked-in resistance to future wildfire severity. So we're currently implementing this approach in our latest research effort, which expands upon our seedling survival and climate data collection to 3 high-severity burn patches in northern New Mexico. So far, we've planted 10,000 ponderosa pine seedlings, installed 400 microclimate data loggers, and importantly, begun monitoring the survival and growth of those seedlings. Our results will provide site-specific planting plans for each of those fire footprints, as well as improve our overall models of seedling survival and inform where the budget for reforestation can be used most effectively across northern New Mexico. With the data from those 3 sites, we can then produce a seedling survival probability map for each fire footprint across New Mexico, and with widespread enough data across the Southwest. And this will help us refine those models, increase their accuracy, and inform future planting decisions. By being able to accurately predict where reforestation efforts are most likely to be successful, we can govern the structure of those future forests and bake in resistance to fire, high severity wildfire by reducing stand density. So we end up with those sparse forests whose structure will be reinforced by frequent low severity wildfire, and not those dense forests whose structure increases the probability of high severity wildfire in the future. And by using nucleation planting, with gaps between planting efforts, we can create breaks which reduce the potential for wildfire spread. So a few take-homes from our research that our research so far has highlighted is that we can increase planted seedling survival by identifying locations on the landscape that decrease solar radiation and increase water retention. And we can do that by leveraging topographical and vegetation features which are already on the landscape. In terms of topographical features, we can map those, and planters can be trained to identify areas that buffer against high temperatures at the microsite scale. Also, we can plant forests that we want, not overplant, expecting high mortality, but potentially ending up with forests which increase the chances of high severity wildfire in the future. And by utilizing mapping methods, we can reduce the amount of reforestation waste and use cost-effective planting strategies, which at the same time create fire-resistant forests. Also, we can incorporate up-to-date monitoring data and iteratively update our models with each new planting effort with post-planting monitoring data there as well. So if you're interested in engaging with our lab and helping improve those models, any planted seedling survival data can be incorporated into those machine learning models, which would help improve their predictive strength. So if you have any data of planted seedling survival, live or dead, 1 to 3 years after planting with precision GPS coordinates, we can use it. Okay, that's the end. I think I went a bit quickly, but thanks very much. And if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer those. But I'm going to leave you with, what do you call these guys? QR codes, in case you want to look up any of the studies that I mentioned there.
Thank you so much, Chris. You covered an amazing amount of material in a very short time. So we'll just go ahead and jump straight into questions. I'm sure that people will have a lot. I know I already have a few.
Okay.
Start out, and just in case anyone hasn't seen the chat, or I've been bugging all the attendees, if you do have any questions for Chris, please type them there, and we'll get to them one by one. So Robin asked, going back to, I think it was study 1 or 2, if you could talk a little bit more about how you applied the biochar. So was it placed in the planting hole, mixed in the soil, or something else? And then what type of biochar you used? So what material was used to create it?
Okay, so for that study, we collaborated with Joey Blankenship in Arizona, and he provided us with the biochar. It was based on pecan shells, and it was basically we organized where we were going to plant seedlings and excavated a chunk of soil, mixed that in with biochar, and put it back in that in the soil, and then planted 4 weeks later. So there was enough time for that biochar to sort of settle and do its thing before we planted those seedlings. All of that's detailed in the paper in study 2 with the actual specifics of that, including amounts. We covered that in quite a lot of detail there. What we are looking at currently with some of our project partners is incorporating biochar in the actual media of seedlings when they go into the ground. So we're setting up an experiment now where we're going to use different amounts of biochar and co-composted biochar and lots of different media types to see if we obviously biochar has the potential to be a great carbon sequestration method. And also, if it increases seedling survival, that's a double win. But going out to the field, excavating soil, mixing it with biochar, what we did in that experiment was like a boutique seedling survival thing. I don't think we could do it at large scales. So with our latest experiment that we're doing with the folks at NMSU and Joey again, is using that as media for those seedlings. So when they're planted, they already have the benefit of biochar. Hopefully that will show some results, but I would encourage you, if you've got any questions about application rate, etc., to look at the paper, because it's all in there and I can't remember it.
Okay, great. So now one more question from Robin. We're going to bump ahead to study 3 that you just covered. So in relation to the topographic indices, what does unsuitable for planted seedlings mean? And is that based on a survival threshold or something else?
So I'll go back to that slide because that's probably the most useful thing to have up on the screen when we're talking about that. So this is the probability of seedling survival after 3 years for ponderosa pine. And yeah, it's based on a probability. So it's using boosted regression trees in a binary sense, a 0-1 probability rating for ponderosa pine within the landscape. So unsuitable is very low probability and suitable is very high probability. What we basically did is above, in the paper, so above 0.75, 75% probability of survival after 3 years. Down there on the left-hand side, you can see that little density plot that I put there, which I tried to highlight the fact that not a lot of that landscape is high probability. Also, I just want to point out that we were very conservative with our statistical methods here. So we ran the model with subsets of data that we collected on seedling survival 10 different times and took the average of those 10 different models and combined them. Even though if we were to use all of the data in a single machine learning model, a single boosted regression tree effort would have probably increased that accuracy, but we wanted to be conservative about that. The benefit of these type of topographical models is that we can just process that DEM and take it to anywhere, because all of those variables are available just as a product of processing that digital elevation models in different ways. The thing which is lacking in this model, which we're trying to tackle in our current project with over the 3 different burn sites, is the elevation component. So because we were just in one site when we did this across an elevation gradient, it didn't give us very good predictions if we went lower or higher than that. So we're hoping to improve and integrate more topographical variables in future models, so we can improve those models and spread them to larger areas. But yeah, so one of the big benefits to this kind of process with machine learning is that we can incorporate all types of data, and it just needs to be a GPS point and a 0 or 1 for live dead of that seedling, and it can go in the model, which means we can iteratively improve the model's predictions over multiple years and different planting projects. So yeah, please get in touch if you've got any data along those lines.
So there are a couple of questions in the chat that kind of feed into this, but I'll ask the one first that has to do with this study and what we're talking about right now. Let's see, Andrew asked, how well do you think the findings based on topographic indices would apply to other systems, say the Southern Sierra Nevada? And do you have an interest in collaborating on the survival of planted giant sequoias?
Yes, to the last bit. So there's some slight caveats to this, that because we did this based on one location so far, we know that these variables will probably behave in a similar way in a lot of different areas, but that will be dependent on the underlying climate regimes in those particular systems. So if we were to go further north or higher in elevation, this model, as we built it currently, would probably be quite pessimistic. And similarly, if we were going to go down south and lower in elevations, it would be probably quite optimistic in those terms, which is what we're trying to tackle in the current project. But moving across to a different species in a different climate regime, probably the best way to do it would be to monitor those seedling survival and growth in that particular environment and build the model up using the same kind of variables. We could even include some others there as well. So we're currently working with some tribal groups in this area with the guys at Jemez Pueblo, who want the same sort of model for their tribal lands, but for Douglas fir. So we'll be working with them to create that model, but it involves sampling Douglas fir seedling survival in those landscapes and then producing a different model. The hope is that we can create similar models for a bunch of different species over really large areas, and then iteratively improve those models based on more data as we get it. I think that answers the question. I'm not entirely sure. Tell me if I didn't, I'm sorry.
No, I think that answers the question. And Andrew, I'll go ahead and put Chris's contact information in the chat so that if you or anyone else wants to get a hold, you're able to.
Back to this guy, just in case.
Okay. Thank you for having that up. So Jonathan was asking about a different factor that might influence your models. Wondering, how does future climate change figure into the use of these predictive services?
Okay, great question. Okay, so because those models can't predict those climate conditions, but do predict how those climate conditions are distributed across a landscape, those favorable sites will still be favorable in 50 years when mean temperature is up by 15 degrees Celsius or 40 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever it is. But all of those predictions, the probability of seedling survival in those models will be reduced because it's under a different climate regime, which is probably hotter and drier. So it kind of points to something that I like to talk to about land managers here, is that there is a window of planted seedling survival. And as we move into hotter, drier climates in the future, that window is closing. So if we would like to reforest those landscapes, that climatic niche that those seedlings have will more or less stay the same. Hang on, we have a slide almost purpose made for this. This guy. So if we think about that juvenile survival threshold in an environmental space will stay the same, and the overarching environmental system that it finds itself, if we replace that adult survival threshold with the environmental system, that's going to move right and or left, depending on how you see it, and probably move outside of the range of that juvenile survival threshold, which is our planted seedling. So it's important for areas, particularly large areas like the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire or those large high severity burn patches, that we plant those sooner rather than later. We also see in the Los Conchas fire footprint that we've worked in for quite a lot, that after long periods of time, so that fire happened in 2011, those areas quickly get dominated by shrubs and grasslands, which, whilst shrubs like gamble oak provide shade for seedlings and promote their survival and growth to a certain degree, other shrub species, like we have New Mexico locust here, doesn't have the same effect. So it just acts as a competitor for some different seedling species. So that relationship between shrubs and planted seedlings can be species specific. So that's something to take into consideration. Also, invasive grass species are a big problem in the Los Conchas. And if you've ever dug up a lot of wild grass, you'll see that its roots are really thick and go down relatively deep. So when we're planting our seedlings, they're in direct competition with the grasses which are around them. But if we look at gamble oak, for instance, they have very deep roots and have a bit of hydraulic lift where they lift moisture up from deep in the soil, and actually can be beneficial for those seedlings in terms of solar radiation buffering and moisture retention. I've forgotten what the question was, I'm sorry. But did I get out of that at all? I think
you were digging into future climate change.
Oh, right. Okay. Future climate. Yeah. So those windows will close. Plant sooner rather than later. Otherwise, we're going to have our work cut out for us in terms of selecting survivors. Another slide for this. And basically making drought tolerant seedlings when they go into the ground, because that might increase their survival, but there's a lot of science which needs to happen there and in the sort of nursery setting. Currently, we can map where to plant them and increase their survival by quite a lot.
So I think that this all feeds into a larger conversation about what reforestation is going to look like in a future where the climate is hotter and drier and fires are more severe, as that trend continues. But maybe we'll save that for the end of the discussion for now, so we can get to a few other questions.
Sure.
So digging into the microclimate a little more, we just talked about future climate change. But both Robin and Sharon were wondering about other factors that might influence seedling survivability. So Robin was wondering if you tried different stock types or different seedling specs. So looking at root collar diameters, shoot to root ratios, and more. And Sharon was wondering if you had or sampled different soil types.
So I'll answer that second question first, because I just got back from last week of taking soil samples from those 3 sites, which are currently part of our project. Let me find that slide there. So we took soil samples from each of these sites. The idea being that we're going to grow seedlings within these solid soil samples, which are large tubes. They're 40 centimeters across and 4 inches, and we can grow a seedling in each of those and basically starve them of water to see which soil types retain the most moisture over the longest period of time. And hopefully, with some remote sensing and that thermal imagery from drones, we can hopefully try and map those soil types across different areas based on some other USGS data as well, to see if we can predict what those soil types are. Interestingly, in Ute Park, as soon as we got down to about 30 centimeters in depth, we hit really clayey soil. And then you look around you and see all the trees that never really grew above about 15 feet. And then you kind of figure out why. So that will have an impact on what we're trying to expect from reforestation outcomes in the future when we're replanting those kind of sites. Do we just want to increase the amount of trees on the landscape, or do we want to maximize like carbon sequestration? And then we can type of pick maybe our stock type or the way that we're producing those seedlings so they do best in those landscapes. Which kind of brings me on to the first question, which is, it was like selecting seedlings before we plant them, stock type, seed source, that kind of thing. We're looking quite heavily into seed source, especially assisted migration. A big idea is to move some what are typically Mexican pine species up when we reforest these areas, as they're probably going to be more drought tolerant and more heat tolerant. And that's probably a good idea, but where that lands politically, I don't quite know yet. But seed selection is definitely a thing that we're trying to incorporate, and we're working with our collaborators at NMSU at the Forest Research Center in Mora for some of that, where they've been looking at low elevation seedling sources and moving them higher up in elevation, and they will probably do better than that when they're at higher elevation than where they existed originally. One of the main problems that we have when we're doing, basically when we're having that resource, those seedlings, when we're getting them out of the nursery, and what we're trying to think about is we have a big problem with scale in the Southwest. So just for New Mexico, we're going to need about 5 million seedlings a year for 5 years straight to recover, well, replant those areas that we've lost to high severity wildfire. Which is a lot. So we need to identify methods which can be scaled up. So whilst it would be great to use bigger containers to grow our seedlings, because that's been shown to increase survival and growth over the long term, if that's cost effective in terms of survival and the space that it takes up in a greenhouse, that will probably need further study. And if we're selecting out certain seedlings to do plant in either very desirable areas that we want forests in, which have been subjected to high severity wildfire, to like guarantee that we're going to have forests in those areas, or do we plant those with the guys who weren't doing so well in the nursery, so we can hedge our bets and plant those good guys in low probability areas? That's going to be like a cost benefit analysis that we can probably do down the line, but I don't really have the answers to that at the moment. But it's something that we're looking at. But the thing we're trying to focus on in the lab, or I'm trying to focus on at the moment, is identifying methods which increase planted seedling survival across species, which can be scaled up to an almost industrial scale. That's why biochar as part of the media for those seedlings will be potentially important. And as well as that mapping piece could be scaled up to large areas. But the potentially measuring stem width and stuff of each seedling before we plant it probably isn't something that we can do at scale just yet.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And for folks who are having trouble hearing me, let me know if my audio is any better now. So Justin was wondering, what sensors are you typically using for aerial data? RGB only, or are multi-spec and LiDAR needed?
Okay, so for our drone footage, we typically just using RGB imagery for those 3-dimensional maps. We basically plan these mapping missions with drones and take that sort of traditional 2-dimensional imagery and then process it with software like Agisoft Metashape to create those 3-dimensional maps. We're also just about starting to use thermal imagery, where we can create 3-dimensional thermal maps of each of those sites, and using those microclimate data loggers, we can then really zero in on like getting those thermal maps very accurate to different months of the year as well as times. Basically, we want to avoid planting in areas which get really hot during the hottest months. And if we can identify those, then that would be a big benefit. But also it has an impact on stuff like soil moisture and soil temperature, and that's where the sort of soil structure piece comes in as well. So that's what we're trying to work out with our current model. We have yet to use multispectral stuff. I would very much like to. And what I'm personally very interested in because I hopefully stole some ideas from the food science world, is that we can use hyperspectral sensors on seedlings in the nursery to identify traits in the hyperspectral spectrum, which can potentially signal drought tolerance or heat tolerance, or resistance to other elements in the landscape that we might encounter. So if we could, I have a slide about this, there we go. So if we could identify those seedlings which are going to do well in harsh environments when they're in the greenhouse, then that might become part of the selection process, but that's down the line. But for all of this stuff, RGB and a bit of thermal imagery on the drones. Yeah, that's about it.
Great, thank you. So jumping down to Sharon's other question, she said that you mentioned that a 46% increase in survivability was seen when planting under shrubs versus out in the open. And wondering, what was your ultimate best survival rate and what variables did that include?
Right, okay. So this is a survival probability model. I think it's a Kaplan-Meier method of survival probability. So when we were planting these, we had 250 in each treatment type in each species. So our highest survival rate, well, highest survival probability, as you can see there with ponderosa pine on the left, their survival probability was, without looking at the paper, I don't know, but that looks about 76, 77% to me, and that's underneath shrubs with biochar. So we saw that bump in survival probability from biochar across the species, which is pretty cool. So you can see that difference there between open and open biochar for ponderosa in the bottom right, and that increase bumping up if they're planted under shrubs as well. And that kind of follows for those other species, white pine and Douglas fir, which is cool because whilst we have maybe species-specific relationships between increased survival if we're planting under New Mexico locust or gamble oaks, for example. The biochar doesn't seem to be species-specific, so that might just bump up that survival rate, regardless of what the species of seedling is or where it's planted, which could potentially be a great benefit. We just need to work out a way of scaling up using biochar in an effective way. And I think that's partly introducing it into the media of seedlings in the greenhouse, in the nursery, and then planting them out like that. But hopefully that answers the question. So basically, if we planted under shrubs with biochar, they did very well.
Okay, great, thank you. And anyone who's asking these questions, if you have follow-up, please feel free to post that in the chat or just raise your hand and we can ask you to unmute. So moving along, Matt was wondering if your data makes the distinction between shrub types, which you already covered, and does it include understory, i.e. grass as well, which you also mostly covered, but if there's anything that you want to elaborate on, feel free to.
We haven't done any extensive field experiments with grass yet, but we will be covering that with the latest project. Because we planted so many seedlings in relatively small areas there and have these really detailed drone imagery from that, we can quantify the environment that each of those seedlings was planted, as in distance to shrub, grass cover, all of those things that we'll be including in future models. My lab colleague, Joe Crockett, did a paper which specifically looked at the difference between seedling growth under New Mexico locust and gamble oak. And I will try and get that citation in the chat if I can figure out a way of getting. But yeah, really good paper. We also had some work done by Dan Krofchek, who used to be in the lab, who looked at allometric variables based on different species and basically their ability to intercept solar radiation and provide shade, but not too much shade, and increase water availability for planted seedlings under those two different types of shrub species. But in New Mexico, where all of our sites happen, we have pretty limited different shrub species in each one of those high severity burn areas. It's either gamble oak or New Mexico locust, mostly gamble oak, to be honest, but we do have a site in the Lunar Fire footprint, which has a lot of aspen. So we're going to be looking at the relationship between planted seedling survival and aspen cover as well, just to see if that's a big competitor or not. That aspen comes up really quick, and it seems to bounce back from high severity wildfire really well because of the collective root bulb and shared resources for aspen. But it's not particularly good at resisting wildfire, comes back really thick, and it's basically a time bomb for high severity wildfire in the future. So we're trying to figure out if we can plant in those areas or if they're just sort of out of line because of competition with aspen. So we'll also be figuring that out as well.
Yeah, this might be off the rails a little bit, but you bringing up aspen makes, as the first successional species in high severity areas, does make me wonder about the microhorizon and what interactions you might see, underground with, aspen that are regenerating and planted coniferous species.
Yeah, so aspen's kind of cool, and then it's a switch hitter mycorrhizal fungi wise. It uses both types, which I can't remember the names of currently. So there's potential benefits there, but it's also potential benefits for grass species and everything else. But we're kind of looking into that in a way. It might be that aspen comes back where you've got patchworks of high severity wildfire, which are next to low severity wildfire, and those conditions for aspen to bounce back are pretty good on the edges where there wasn't really high severity wildfire. In the Los Conchas footprint, you see big areas which are covered by really thick aspen, but those were traditionally ponderosa pine forests, and it will be sort of a reforestation and societal question, I guess, whether it's, do you let those aspen come back with abandon and potentially go up in flames again, or do you try and recreate the forests which were previously there, which was what I was trying to get back to with that sort of choice of planting location and having the ability to map where tree seedling survival would do particularly well. Gives you a chance to create those relatively sparse stands and bake in sort of high severity wildfire resistance in the future. Typically, we see that with sort of planting efforts that you plant in very dense areas, typically next to roads. But if all those seedlings do well, you're creating those really dense forests, which when they grow back are probably going to go up again. So yeah, sorry, I've forgotten what the question was again.
No, it wasn't really a question. It was more just
okay.
That was great. So we do have a few minutes left. If anyone else wants to post a question in the chat or raise their hand and ask a question. Lee did ask if you're looking for other study sites where you can perform monitoring.
Currently, no. So we've got those 3 sites in northern New Mexico. Our current funding is from the USDA NEFA fund, and to be honest, we've stretched ourselves quite thin trying to do those 3 sites with 10,000. It's a lot of field work. And those sites, as I've kind of labeled there, we picked those because they cover a nice elevation gradient between them all. So we can have that elevation gradient as part of future models. But if you have private land, especially, which you would like some research done on, please get in contact. I'd be interested to hear about it. We can probably cook up more funding for stuff like that. But yeah, at the moment, kind of, stretched to my limit doing all of the field work currently with the monitoring data for all of those 10,000 and seedlings and the microclimate data loggers, which the elks find very tasty, which is sub-ideal. But yeah, if you private land especially, it gets rid of a lot of the red tape, and if we can dig up soil and stuff, so we don't need permits from Forest Service or whoever else, that's really helpful. So do get in touch if you have private land available that we can do some research in. That'd be great.
Great. So it sounds like Lee, you should follow up maybe in an email.
Sure.
Just to let folks know, I will be sending out all of the citations that I posted earlier in the chat. Chris, some of those other papers that you've mentioned, if you want to send them to me, I'll go ahead and send them to all registrants after as well. So Shantini was wondering, Daniel was wondering if you could quickly revisit how the growth rate was affected under shrub cover. Just go back.
Sure. So this is, wrong slide, this is growth rate. So they are all fairly steady. Douglas fir seems to be on a slow and steady course, which is probably good to avoid like a boom and bust thing for seedling survival. We typically find that after 3 years, our seedlings, if they're alive then, they'll do pretty well. That sort of climatic niche that each of those seedlings, when they're planted, has slowly expands year on year, so they can deal with drought periods or particularly high temperatures. But that jump that we see in height growth for ponderosa, that undershrubs, that's probably due to both water availability undershrubs, their need to grow high to get to the sunlight, but also reduced growth of those ponderosa which are in the open in dealing with really hot, dry environments. So it's probably a split between those two, which is why we're seeing that big increase in height growth. Diameter growth for ponderosa, there wasn't any real difference between those different groups, and the same for the other species, really, the ones who survived. So the growth strategy of white pine and Douglas fir seems to be more conservative. which is probably good for long-term survival. For ponderosa, they seem to go fairly quick if they're in the right conditions. They're drought tolerant and shade tolerant, so it makes sense that they would do well in environments which are, I'm going to pronounce this wrong because I can never pronounce it right, allegorious to the conditions that they've evolved to grow as seedlings in, which is in the shade of mummy or daddy tree. And underneath shrubs is probably similar to that. So it makes sense that they do well in those environments, but you have to sort of look out for that competition bit. I hope that answers the question. I'm not entirely sure if it does.
Yeah, I think that was a good explanation. Thank you.
Okay.
So we're right at the top of the hour. We'll give it just another couple minutes in case anybody has some more questions. Justin did want to reach out and say thank you and let you know that they're using RGB, multispectral, and LiDAR. They're currently focused on RGB data and will be capturing aerial seedling imagery over various customer sites on the West Coast. So this will be utilizing RTK and approximately 1 centimeter per pixel imagery. They'll also be focused on reforestation projects in Montana and New Mexico next, if it's helpful to collaborate on the findings.
Yeah, that'd be great. Shoot us an email. I would love to develop methods of monitoring seedling growth and survival with drones. So particularly with this current project, we went out and basically with RTK survey elmlids, which are accurate, give you a GPS point which is accurate to a couple of centimeters. We have a location for each of those seedlings. So my light bulb moment was like, if you were to program your drone to go to each of those spots with multispectral imagery, particularly, we could see if they're alive or dead. And maybe down the road, when we remove Vexar, which is this plastic shield that we use to reduce herbivory in the first few years, once we remove that, we could potentially get LiDAR or structure from motion photogrammetry to measure seedling growth year to year. It would be great to develop a method for that, which is somewhat automated. I'd be interested in chatting about that, especially if you're doing 1 centimeter per pixel. That seems to be doable. And if we had the multispectral side of it as well, then you could delineate between leaf and woody growth, and that would be very cool for like the sort of carbon capture element of it as well. So if we could do that down the line with 10-year-old seedlings or 5-year-old seedlings, you could, with enough wood density samples of those seedlings, you could have a decent carbon sequestration estimate based on reforestation projects, which would be very cool. So yeah, get in touch, I guess. Thanks.
Yeah, sounds like there's a lot of great stuff coming down the road. So we'll keep our eyes peeled. Last thing before we log off, Matt, I think you're still on. Can you, Chris, can you just move ahead to the second to last slide? Matt just wanted to see it one more time.
Second to last slide. I take it it's, so the second to last slide is that, but okay. That's interesting. Oh, for contact details?
I think okay. For contact details, yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, my bad. I was like, you don't want to look at that. Also, right. I guess the same contact details are below, but if you want to whip your phone out there, put the QR codes for each of those papers that I talked about today there as well.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today and taking the time to give this presentation and ask all of these really engaging questions. Thanks to everybody who logged on today to join the conversation and ask anything that you're curious about. And I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes in the future. So thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you. Cheers.